In this lesson, we're going to create the Prisma schema and then use that schema to then generate the database schema and our TypeScript types. So we'll first start by creating a Prisma folder for ourselves here. And we'll put everything in this Prisma folder related to Prisma. So the first thing that we need to create is this schema file. We need to call this schema.prisma. And once we've got that, then we can begin setting up our schema. The first two blocks have nothing to do with our app at all, or nothing to do with the types in our app, but rather are there in order to scaffold and configure our Prisma project. So the blocks are pretty self-explanatory. The first block is describing the database with the URL to that database, and then what type of database it is. In our case, a Postgres database. Then the next section describes what we will be using this Prisma types and schema with. So we need to put this in here because Prisma is actually able to generate clients for many different languages. So we can specify different providers for different languages in here if we wanted to generate clients for multiple languages. We're also able to add in some other options as well and do some configuration, which we don't need to do yet. So if you're on Apple Silicon, you might need to add the binary targets here to the generator so that it generates the correct type of client. And if you're using PNPM like I am, you'll need to specify the output for this client. The reason for this is that because we're doing PNPM with Nuxt 3, we have to include the shamefully hoist option with the installation. And so then the structure of the node modules folder is a little bit different than what Prisma is expecting. So this just gives it another hint so that it ends up in the right spot. So now that we have our basic setup done, we need to add in the different types. In Prisma, they're called models, and they map directly to database tables as well as the TypeScript types. So our first model is the course model. In it, we have the ID, the title, just as we have in here, in our course, we have a title. And so we're adding in this ID so that we can reference this course uniquely. We'll also add in the created at and updated at field. These are really useful because we can easily see when this object was created in the database and the last time it was updated. You'll also notice that we've got some of these attributes here. And so these map to special meta info about the object that our database will use, and Prisma will also use in our TypeScript client. So ID specifies that this field here will be used as the ID property. And this here specifies that by default, we are just going to auto increment this. So we'll start with 1, and then for every course that we add, it'll auto increment it. If you are familiar with SQL or SQL, then these will look familiar to you. So created at, by default, it will use the current time, and then we'll use this special updated at attribute for updated at. Our chapter model is very similar. We've got the ID, we've got created at and updated at, as well as the different fields in our model. And lastly, we'll add in our lesson. Now this one has a few more fields, but the format is the same as the other ones. The only interesting thing to note here is that this string here is optional. So we have this question mark, just like we would see in TypeScript. That question mark lets us denote that this field is optional. So if we come back to our course file here where we define the different types, you can see that this maps pretty closely to what we have got here. The only difference is that with our course, we have chapters, which includes the chapter type. We have lessons, which includes the lesson type. And so what we need to do next is to define the relationships between these different models. So in our SQL database, we would be able to define relationships using foreign keys that reference the ID of other tables in the database. In Prisma, these are called relations, and we can define them by using these attributes. The only difference here in Prisma is that we need to define that attribute on both models, whereas in a database, depending on what the relationship is between the two tables, you may only need to define it in one table. So if we wanted to add the lesson relation to our chapter, we could add this lessons here. At first, it gives us an error, but then when we save it, it will actually auto update. And we didn't see this because it was scrolled below out of view here, but it adds in this chapter and chapter ID field. And so what this is saying is that every lesson has a chapter, and we'll include the chapter ID in the lesson table. Now, up till now, we've been sort of thinking about it as each course has a bunch of chapters and each chapter has a bunch of lessons. But saying that a lesson belongs to a chapter is the opposite way or inverse way of saying that a chapter has many lessons. And so that's exactly what this database is doing, in that each lesson has a field on it that specifies which chapter it belongs to. In our database, there is no field for this lessons here. In addition, this chapter object here does not exist in our database. This is just a Prisma thing. So this lessons here is just for Prisma, and this chapter object here is also just for Prisma. And this relation attribute, what it's doing here is saying that this chapter ID field here references the ID on our chapter, so that we know that this chapter here is actually linked to this ID. And so in that way, in our database, every single lesson object will include a chapter ID that links to a specific chapter that it is a part of. And then when Prisma fetches that data, it can tell which chapter each lesson is a part of. And it can also do some really nice things for us, that instead of requiring us to figure out and put this data together, when we grab a lesson object, we'll also be able to grab the chapter object. And so that's why this is here. This is only a Prisma thing, but it's there because it makes our lives a little bit easier. So although it auto-completed it for us, it's actually a little incorrect because these relations are not optional. So we'll remove those question marks, and now that's correct. And we have only one other relationship that we need to add in, and that is from the course to the chapter. So each chapter contains a bunch of lessons, and each course contains a bunch of chapters. And again, when we save, it auto formats this and adds in this relation here, but it is not optional, so we'll just clean that up. And now our schema is complete. If you want to learn more about Schema in Prisma, I highly encourage you to go to their docs. They have a very in-depth and well-written documentation that explains a lot of what's going on and how it relates to TypeScript as well as the underlying database schema. It's also useful to read up on SQL and database schemas in general if you want a deeper understanding here. But since this course is about Nuxt, we won't go into that any more than this lesson. So in our next lesson, we'll be taking this model and initializing our database and then seeding it with the course data that we need in order to use our application.